Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a really excellent panel here for you. My name is Jessica Huisman. I am a reporter with ProPublica, and I am going to be moderating a panel to talk about what's on everybody's mind, I think, today, which is the way that we're going to be the way that we're going to be administering elections, both now and the time of the pandemic, and what that can teach us about whether or not we should move to a more online environment or a mail-in environment for those elections. So I'm going to let each of the panelists just say a little bit about both themselves and their thoughts on this issue. But first I'll just quickly introduce them. First we have Sarah Hunt, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Joseph Rainey Center for Public Policy, which is a think tank with the goal of empowering the voices of women, minorities, and mavericks in public policy. We also have John Pudner, the executive director of Take Back Our Republic, which is a nonprofit educating the public on conservative solutions for campaign finance reform. And finally, we have Kevin Kosar, the vice president of research partnerships for R Street, which is an organization that engages in public policy research and outreach to promote free markets and limited effective government. So Sarah, I would love to turn first to you.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. First of all, is everyone hearing me all right? I always wonder in Zoom meetings if you can hear. I'm so delighted to be here and with a wonderful panel. I have so much respect for Jessica, John, and Kevin. This will be a great conversation, and I'm sure that I will learn more than I can bring to the table. You left out one of my favorite parts of my bio, that I'm on the board of Take Back Our Republic. So I love the work that they do over there, and I'm excited to be on a panel with John for that reason as well. Before I founded the Rainey Center and moved to DC, I was a Republican political lawyer. So I have an interesting perspective as someone who has been an attorney, for elections, for ballot measures, for candidates and political parties, in looking forward to how is COVID-19 and what we're living through now going to change our elections process. And I think the number one takeaway that we can all have is a really good one, and that's that in America, there are a lot of different ways that people can vote. We have innovated in across the states, whether it's vote by mail, absentee ballots. Alaska now, for example, allows service members deployed overseas to fax in their ballots so they can be counted more timely. West Virginia now allows digital voting for people with disabilities who have medical conditions that prevent them from going to the polls. We have early voting in many states now. And when you're dealing with a crisis, whether it's a pandemic or a hurricane or a terrorist attack, and you've got to hold an election. Just like I live in DC, we had our primary election on Tuesday. We have a lot of unrest in our streets, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic going on, but we still had to have that election. And people were able to go to the polls. They were also able to request absentee ballots. The point is, when you have more options for how people can vote in a safe and secure way, the easier it is to adapt to a crisis situation to protect both our democratic process as well as the health and safety of the public. And I think we can be really proud that as Americans, we have that in place already, and that many of our jurisdictions, not all of them, okay, to be fair, have been flexible about how they approach elections during this time. I think one of the key things that I see looking forward is we're also seeing some of the weaknesses in our system, and the fact that many county clerks and state systems, they're operating on old computer systems, old software, old technology, whether it's for ballot scanners, and it might be time to invest in some upgrades and really prioritize that. So when we're looking at infrastructure spending or future COVID relief bills, and even as states go and try to figure things out, it's important to remember that free and fair elections are the heart of our democratic processes. And we need to make sure that we have adequate cybersecurity, that we have adequate facilities to adapt. You can't just stand up a vote by mail or largely absentee ballot election overnight. I practice law in Oregon, which is one of the first vote by mail states. It's a different process. If you're sending out ballots to everyone, in terms of security, in terms of what you need to do to maintain your voter rolls, in terms of how you count and scan things, Like, you have to have capacity. You know, if you're used to having polls, you might have 2 scanners or 1 in a county clerk's office. And what happens if, because of the pandemic, you've all of a sudden switched to all vote by mail and you only have 1 scanner? It means that your results could be delayed by several days. So thinking about that kind of infrastructure and what people need, not only for this fall's election, but to adapt going forward. There are also, I think, one of the things, you know, we're seeing is people are talking about some of these adaptations in a more polarized fashion. And I think that's disappointing. I wish I could say I didn't think that will continue, but I think it will. At the risks of both sidism, I can say that being a conservative or Republican who's lived in largely blue states my entire life, I promise you that Democrats engage in anti-democratic practices to maintain their power in those states as much as folks like to suggest that Republicans do in others. I think it's disgusting in either case. I'm not trying to defend it by saying there are good people on both sides, but I think we need to be honest about our political system and the incentives that are at play, and the fact that, frankly, in most states, we let the fox guard the hen house around the issues of our elections and how they're administered. So if we keep trying to polarize these issues, we're not going to fix the problem of accessibility, of the very legitimate concerns about security issues that surround these things. I think it's sometimes very funny on vote by mail when Democrats start talking about Republicans making up security issues around vote by mail, when in fact we had an actual voter fraud case in North Carolina involving absentee ballots that were harvested and then improperly, illegally filled out by a Republican operative for the benefit of a Republican candidate. We had to have a whole redo election. That's something that actually happened that probably, frankly, cost the Democrats that House seat, given how close things were. So, you know, there are things that we could do to make different aspects, whether it's digital voting or vote by mail or even voting at the polls, more secure and more accessible at the same time. And we shouldn't shy away from those conversations because of you know, the latest partisan talking points. So that's kind of that's my opening foray. I'm excited to be here and excited to hear from John and Kevin.
I muted myself. Sorry, guys. Why don't we move to John? Can you tell us a little bit about why you're here and your thoughts on this issue? And then we'll move to Kevin and then to Q&A.
Thank you. Well, I think from my observation as a political operative on the ground for years, one quick side note is I'd like us to go to virtual Congress. The number of people who don't run for office just because they don't think they can afford a home in DC as well as back in the district, you know, they're now that we all know how to do these Zoom meetings after the last couple of months, you know, I don't think this sounds that far-fetched to say, let's keep the members back in their districts living with their constituents and let them Zoom to meet with other people as much as possible. So that's a side note. But going into the, you know, I think the central question with mail-in voting and other methods is we always want to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And I would just encourage people not to give the typical academic response if security is brought up, and Sarah kind of alluded to this. You know, the typical academic response is, well, studies show there's hardly any cheating, so you're just making this up. And I think that just prevents any real conversation on this because, look, there is cheating. And it doesn't take too many people who want to cheat. Just being on the ground for years, I can just tell you some personal experiences that would always make us uneasy, both me and Democrats I knew who were working the ground too. I mean, even when we did little things like walk around the polls to check in, not even like security people, but you like to find out how many people voted in a given precinct. So you'll wander around to 15, 20, 30 precincts in the morning. And most of the poll workers, fantastic, wonderful, happy to be part of democracy. Now and then, if I'd be in a heavily Democratic district, I'd get screamed at. Get the hell out of here. You don't vote here. What are you doing in here? You know, so there was that paranoia. And those hyper partisan districts are the ones that make you nervous, where a bad apple can get in and cheat. Now, my Democrat friends, when I tell them that, they would kind of laugh at me and say, well, you have it easy. When I go out to some of the rural, overwhelmingly conservative districts, the guys giving me mean looks and looking at me have guns. You know, so, you know, you're not walking into that. So, you know, both sides see it. So there is a danger, whether you're in person or mail-in, when you're in hyper-partisan areas where over 80% support one party or the other, and there are no poll observers for the other side. And Trump almost set a record on this. He won 371 counties with 80% or more of the vote. That's, I believe, by far the all-time record. Some historian may tell me I'm wrong on that, but that was really unheard of. So let's just look at those districts. Sarah already alluded to the one North Carolina case. A friend of mine who became Attorney General of Alabama prosecuted some Republicans in rural Alabama who had cheated on ballots. So we've certainly seen some cheating, and those were all in hyper-partisan areas. Now on the flip side, there are only 17 counties that went over 80%. I'll just say anti-Trump right now since he's the referenda, but in 2016. But you had, for example, Manhattan, the Bronx, all of Philadelphia were over 80% the other way. And so, I have concerns there. And let's remember, we just had a Philadelphia election judge arrested too. He's admitted guilt to casting close to 20% of the votes in every election were him voting for other people when no one was around. And you can say, well, that's just one precinct, but I have unease that, for example, in 2012, a Philadelphia judge did not allow any Republican observers in any of these Philadelphia precincts for about 2 hours at the beginning of the day. And for those people who've worked Cook County and other areas, the hard thing about the beginning of the day is that's when one election judge can actually put points on the board ahead of time. The first thing you want to do is make sure your machine starts at 0. And that's something you had to fight in Cook County and elsewhere. So, between that and not being able to observe the first couple hours, you do worry about just a rogue couple of bad apples voting. So I go into some detail here to say, I wouldn't start the argument with there are no security concerns. There really are. And you do have to watch that. And then, it's a smaller case, but then last week a West Virginia mail carrier got caught for switching ballot applications, so, that can happen. And I'll give you one other case. Once in a referenda in Alabama, I called a precinct to see how we're doing, which is a yes/no referendum. They said, oh, you're winning over 2-1. And I wondered how they knew that. And 2 months before the election, I said, oh, is it mainly people saying things when they bring in their ballot? And they said, no, you're winning 284 to 117. I mean, they were opening all the ballots 2 months ahead of time. Clearly illegal. I don't think there was malintent there, but we are dealing with humans. And so we do have to look at, with mail-in ballots, and there's some hyper screaming about mail-ins all going to be fraudulent. I certainly don't think that's the case, but I think we want to ask maybe the question, hey, could mail-in be more secure? Are there less threats in fraudulent voting there than in in-person voting? I think that gets a more logical discussion going. I even took that on to Breitbart Radio last week, and got a somewhat good response from some people. Certainly got trashed by many in the comment field for suggesting mail-in voting be expanded. But I think if we start with that, you diffuse that, oh, there's no cheating, oh, there's tons of cheating. Like, okay, let's just try to make sure there's not cheating. And what method is it in person you want to use, and what is it in mail-in? And you really want to go down to just the one signature being required. It's awfully hard after what some states are suing to do, or people are suing states. It's really awfully hard to go back and say, well, we realized a bunch of signatures didn't match. Well, what are you going to do at that point after the vote? Throw away vote. You don't know who those are linked to. I mean, I think you can take steps with mail-in to make it safer. But we certainly need to make it accessible. Part of the other question in closing was, do we just go completely to mail-in? I do think Nevada made a mistake in doing that this year, particularly because if you're going to do it, and Washington state officials have said this, it took them years to really get over to this wide-scale mail-in voting, and to try to do it suddenly in the middle of a couple of crises that we have going on now, I think it's a mistake. I think you have to still make in-person voting possible, and I think funding for the National Guard to wipe down machines and maybe provide masks at polling places. I mean, I'll leave that to the health experts, but I think you need to put money into making in-person accessible. If you go completely to mail-in, I'm sure even with all publicity, people are going to show up the day of the election in Nevada and realize they haven't been able to vote. And ironically, there's the Democratic Party who's suing the Nevada Secretary of State for taking away the in-person option. And, that's kind of interesting. she's in really a bad spot. Trump's going after her for making it all mail in. Democrats are going after her for taking away the in-person. So she's getting hit from both sides. And I'd particularly point out, you need to keep the in-person for young people as an option too. I know they'd rather vote online, but they certainly don't go to post offices much or use mail. I mean, talk to some young people, I'm sure you all have, who don't know how to address an envelope. It's just, I know they're self-addressed for mailing, but if you look at California 25 and the big kind of win for Republicans, split the seat a few weeks ago, it's less than 20% of young people voted, and 3 times as many seniors. So I think you've got to keep in-person accessible too. And as Sarah alluded to, we need as many options as possible. And let's look electronic too. That's a whole other set of issues. But I think you've got to expand. You've got to at least go to mailing out applications for mail-in. I would not advocate and been against mailing out ballots. There is a problem with having everyone know when 1 million ballots hit an area in a part of a state all at once. That's when they know they're in trash cans. They know you can't even mailbox rob. That's when I think you're inviting fraud. So we come right up the line on, I'm all for the mailing applications, even like Michigan did, but I don't think you mail out unsolicited ballots. You want the ballots coming staggered in the mail so that bad apples don't know when they're all coming, and it doesn't make it easy for them to collect them and perpetrate fraud.
Thanks so much. We're going to move next to Kevin, but I just wanted to remind everyone that if they have questions for the panelists, they can go ahead and type them into the Q&A function, and we will address them as soon as we move to that segment of the panel. Kevin, go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. As noted, I work at the R Street Institute, which is a young think tank in Washington, D.C. I've been here about 6 years. And prior to that, I spent 11 years working on Capitol Hill as a nonpartisan researcher at the Congressional Research Service, where I fielded calls from Democratic and Republican members of Congress and their staff by the hundreds each year. And that was my real education after I got out of grad school in how politics works and how governance works. The voting by mail thing is, been of interest to me for a long time, not least because I do it here in Washington, D.C. I picked up the habit some years ago because it was a personal convenience. I had 4 kids that I was hauling to 3 separate schools in the morning and picking them up in the evening. And the specter of trying to figure out how to make election day work, I was like, no, I'm going to do the vote by mail thing. And I've been very thankful for it. I like being able to sit at my dining room table and to read these issues and think more about the candidates as opposed to just showing up at the ballot box and going, I'll pick the person who's matches my party or whatever. This conference was called because of COVID, and it's themed around the big reopening. COVID has been, just pulling the perspective back, COVID has been unbelievably disruptive to so much of American life, and it's been really disruptive of politics. Politics is an in-person activity for the most part. Lots of stuff happens online over phones and etc. But to politic and to govern requires people to be in the same room. Politics and governance is about collective decision-making. And COVID basically took that away. And right now we see when it comes to Congress, in either the House or the Senate about how they want to be able to function. And it's, to some degree been around the issue of what is the appropriate means for us to cast a vote? Can we do it remotely? Can we do it by proxy? All that sort of stuff. How do we have a hearing if we're not all in a building together? Is that a hearing proper or is that something else? And what does it mean for open government if the video goes down during the course of that hearing and the public can't get in? All sorts of issues are coming up and they're muddling their way through and not doing such a great job. Meanwhile, elections officials, they are doing a better job, not least because they're professionals at administering elections. And dealing with disruptions is part of what they've always had to do. As Sarah alluded to, there are places that regularly get clobbered with hurricanes. Elections officials are got to be ready for that. And they have conferences together and they learn from one another share professional practices, that sort of stuff. So election officials, despite our disaggregated system of 10,000 elections being conducted every year, they're a remarkably competent bunch. It's a beautiful thing about our federalist system, and I am one who's very firmly opposed to Congress trying to come in and nationalize our election system. Voting by absentee ballot and voting by mail is certainly not a new thing in this country. I mean, it was first played with after the Civil War. And if you look at the data over the last 30 years about those who actually vote, as opposed to citizens who don't bother to show up and vote, among those who vote, the percentage who vote in person on election day has slid from a little over 90% to a little over 60%. In short, when given the choice to be able to vote early or to vote through absentee ballot or through vote by mail, people are taking that other option more and more. And it's easy to understand why. I mean, Americans love freedom of choice, but there's also just the flat out convenience thing. And, I know there's a lot of nostalgia about the, Americans going to the polling place and the kind of Norman Rockwell picture of, happy cacophony and excitement and flags waving and all that sort of stuff. Some people like that. A lot of people think it's a real drag. And there are other people who, it just isn't convenient. You don't have the time to go stand in line for 2 hours and then go to work and try to explain to the boss, well, I was voting. Like, yeah, there are election laws that are supposed to protect your right to vote, but the practicality is that, like, if your boss gets pissed and can you, you're just not going to do it. You don't want to cross the aisle. So it's no surprise voting by mail has become increasingly popular over the years, and COVID is just going to drive it even higher. I saw some preliminary data about Indiana yesterday that said 15 times as many absentee ballots were requested than in previous elections. 15 times. Unbelievable number. We've no guarantees that COVID is going to go away this autumn, and setting up elections, administering them is a long, complicated process. I think many administrators are moving, which is a prudent thing to do, towards other options to be ready for this autumn, because you can't wait until October and say, oh, we got to do vote by mail next month. It doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of planning, takes a lot of printing. There are a very limited number of companies who actually are qualified and capable of printing ballots. They're getting jammed with orders. So it's going to be very, put it mildly, interesting this fall to see what happens. There's going to be a huge demand for more early voting and voting by mail and by absentee ballot. And elections administrators and their capacity for handling that's going to be greatly tested. I've advocated that Congress should pony up and just give some general block grants to states so that elections officials can kind of think about, like, where do they most need to put the money. If they want to if they're in a rural area and they want to spread out and have a lot more polling places where a lot of social distancing can be done, and they want to supplement that with a little more voting by mail, they can do that. If it's a dense urban packed area and they don't want to open up polling places at all and they want to shift more heavily to voting by mail, all right, they can do that. Let them choose based upon local circumstances. But states, are facing this situation where the entire legitimacy of who gets to rule the country after November is on the line. And they never budgeted for this. They had no idea this was coming. Their budgets have been slammed by decreased tax revenues coming in. They can't just reach in their pockets and find the money to put towards elections. So I've been in favor, despite being a small government fiscal hawk kind of guy. This is an emergency. We need Congress to step up. We need them to pony up some more dollars and send it to the states so that they can competently run the elections. And they need to do it fast. So with that, I'll stop talking and we can move on.
Thank you all for those thoughtful openings. I really appreciate it. I'd really like to discuss something that's been on my mind the entire time that you guys have been talking. So as a journalist who's covering the new ways in which we're all going to vote now and in November, I've been really taken aback, and perhaps that's just my naivete showing, but I've been really taken aback by how loudly opposed Republicans are to vote by mail. And that has come as a surprise to me because in the past, they've been very much for it, and that the populations that take advantage of vote by mail are older and white and tend to vote Republican. And it seems to me that they're sort of cutting off their own feet on this issue. And so I would love to hear from all of you about why you think this has become so heated and controversial apparently overnight, because it wasn't always. So if we could just go in the same order in which we started, that would be great. Sarah, John, and then Kevin.
I think the answer is that, the president came out very strongly against it. And, generally speaking, Democrat or Republican, the parties do look to their leader, especially if they're sitting president. And I think that's why. And given the way that things pan out on social media and the news, it just became very quickly entrenched. I do agree with you. I think before that happened, many more conservatives and Republicans were, more open to voting by mail. And historically, Republicans, they vote by absentee ballot. The absentee ballots, the vote by mail ballots are more heavily Republican. So it is a bit curious. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned polarization is something I think we'll continue to see that's unfortunate. I don't think it's necessary, and I think part of moving away from that is acknowledging there are some security issues around this, but also saying, hey, we can fix them. I've never thought, I'm a conservative, and I've never thought it was conservative to pretend there isn't a problem or make up a problem and not come with and pretend that we can't solve problems that do exist. So I think if we can have that conversation around solutions, and they can be very small things, that can move things in a better direction.
I would say I'll start with kind of the seed of truth to the concerns, because often there is a seed of truth that then grows into something much bigger that's not true. So I think in areas there are Republicans who would have legitimate concerns. Democrats are much better at what we used to always call the flushing operation. I've been out of running these things for 6 years. Maybe they call it something different, but where they're much better at going out and getting in homes and getting in nursing homes and collecting votes. So the concern there is not actual fraudulent voting. It's just an operative being in the room while you vote, as opposed to, Kevin sitting at his kitchen table and looking through things, someone who is paid to do nothing but collect these ballots. And that can be done large scale. For example, when I was running one race, we did have a Democratic operative who actually brought in 10,000 absentee ballots in a state that doesn't have much mail-in voting. And there were 14,000 registered voters in the county in which they were collected. That made us a little uneasy because that was actually a state then where you had to say you were going to be out of county in order to cast a vote. So I think those are the seeds of just the Democrats being much better on the ground and their communities often being more inviting and them going into a home. Republican field workers, when you go knock on doors, you might get 5 or 10 seconds, even from a right-leaning voter, to say, okay, I'll take your literature and close it. Democrats tend to get more into the it's more a community thing, be invited in, et cetera. So there's this idea of, are they going to have an operation? They have such a big operation this year to do these, maybe not even fraudulent, but to collect votes where someone's not comfortable casting a Republican vote. So that's the seed of truth. The reason I think it's so overblown this year is, one, I'll tell you what just happened in California 25. For those of you who didn't follow it, the Democrat had won that seat. There was a scandal. The Republican just won a mainly mail-in vote just north of Los Angeles. What was the difference? Well, there was a scandal, so that accounts for something. But obviously the candidate who was in the scandal was not one of the candidates, so it's not that big. So last time, Democrats did an incredible flushing operation. They came up from Los Angeles, they collected ballots. Incredible turnout operation. I'm not talking whether there was any fraud or not, just saying it was a huge turnout. This year, the Republican comes back, wins by double digits. What changed? Well, with COVID, you can't walk in and out of nursing homes and through apartments and collect ballots. So ironically, I almost think coronavirus solves the issue for 2020 that might be the legitimate basis for a concern. I just don't think you can do those harvesting operations without advertising that you're here to transmit COVID around to a bunch of other people. God forbid, nursing homes. So ironically, at least a temporary solution, I think it's ill-founded. And, my piece in argument on the Breitbart radio, I said, this is actually an accidental voter suppression by Trump of his own people. I mean, you look at Pennsylvania, 29% of the applicants have been Republicans now because they're hearing mail by vote isn't secure, it's fraudulent. And what they're hearing is, oh, is my vote not really counting? So they're not voting by mail-in. So I do think it's a terrible political miscalculation. And you always fight to get as many of your votes in ahead of time as you can, and then try to get the rest of people election day. And if he keeps this up, Republicans are going to have be way behind the day voting, the actual election day. And that's hard to make up. And, even if you don't have riots and COVID spreading and everything else. So I do think it's a real mistake. I think at least giving in on a temporary broader allowance of mail-in voting would be very wise. But I do know the basis of what got this started. And last thing I should say, I have noticed, if you notice in Trump's last few comments before the protesting started, but before then, he did start to work into every conversation. Oh, but absentee balloting is okay. So I think he's hearing this from Pennsylvania Republicans who are saying, you're killing us. People think they can't vote. So he's trying to thread the needle now and say, oh, but vote absentee. Of course, if you have a reason to try and kind of have his cake and eat it too. But I think it's a miscalculation.
Okay, thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, Jessica, you're quite right. I was just going through some election data this morning, and amongst the elderly in 2016, 30% casted by mail. So yeah, it's a very popular thing, and we know that the elderly tend to be more favorable towards the president, and so this could definitely backfire. Yeah, I mean, why has this become such a polarized thing? It is peculiar. I mean, Republicans have been in favor of vote by mail, certainly in some states. I mean, Florida, most famously, Republicans do quite well, in part because they not only get people to request the ballots, they get them to bring them back. Whereas Democrats have a lower percentage of people in Florida who get the ballots and then go through the step of returning them. And yeah, as the other panelists noted, I think, the first reason this got polarized was the president. This is what presidents are not supposed to do. When there's an issue out there and it's ambiguous as to what is the kind of win-win solution, you should not weigh in as a president. You should actually hold back and then wait till things start to go your direction and then throw your energy behind it and claim victory. Instead, he opened his mouth, got out in front, and all of a sudden you had people running to separate corners. And, there are a few groups on the right who are in the business of kind of banging the gong about election fraud. And so, this has kind of been a great moment for them because they've got a president calling attention to their issues. And so they get to, rise in salience in terms of media attention and citations and stories and things like that. I also think that part of the polarization of this issue right now has been fear of losing. I think we have a president right now who has historically high disfavorable ratings, which, presidential disfavorable ratings are an important metric, and his are quite high. And, this has not been a smooth 4 years. We're, maybe facing 20% unemployment. We got this pandemic going on. It seems like every day there is something in the cycle, some crazy thing happens or something like that. I think there's worry out there. And I think some of that anxiety is being taken out about like, well, the Dems are going to steal the election from us. That's the only way we can deal with the fact that we may be getting our clocks cleaned come November. It's not a healthy response. It's not a rational response, but I think it is part of the response.
Okay, thanks. So there are a couple of really great questions in the Q&A function, and I want to address them quickly. But Jackie wonders how we keep voting lists updated and accurate. And I actually think that that's a really great question because I think this is one of the things, I've been covering election administration for 4 years. And this is one of the things that I think people most misunderstand is list maintenance and the difference between healthy maintenance and a purge, and like when it becomes a purge and when it's actually just good, and what tools people are using to do that. So I'd love to hear from any of you who have thoughts on this about appropriate list maintenance hygiene, and what recommendations that you would have for states to make sure that their lists are updated and accurate, which is all the more important when we start to introduce things like expanded vote by mail.
Well, I think it's routine maintenance when it's a Republican county clerk and a purge when it's a Democrat. I don't know why this is hard. But that said, you do have to do different things if you're going to have vote by mail to ensure that your voter rolls are properly maintained. I think one of the first things that we're all concerned about with voter maintenance right now, which is, sexy and probably a smaller problem than people think, but the fact that we know that foreign governments did hack into county clerk election systems and voter rolls last election cycle in 2016. We know this happened. There's no evidence that they changed anything, but they could have. So that's a concern, and making sure that, for proper voter roll maintenance and security, making sure that all of our county clerks and states have appropriate cybersecurity, hygiene, and the support that they need to obtain whatever services, software and hardware that they need to ensure that their voter rolls cannot be so easily hacked going forward. The second aspect of that is, for example, if you have a vote by mail state, one of the things that you might do is the Secretary of State might cross-reference the registered voter list every year with the income tax returns, just to make sure the addresses match and the names match. That's something that is done, for example. So that's just one approach. I think when you are mailing out ballots that are not solicited, it raises the bar. There are other things that you can do too. You can make sure that it's very easy for people to update their voter registration. You can send them a postcard every couple of years that says, hey, are you still here? Are you still registered to vote here? That's not necessarily the most secure way to do it, but that's one way you can do it. And of course, every time somebody, motor voter, or I just moved, every time someone moves, if you have built into that process, or they are removing or renewing their driver's license, if you have built into that process an ability to cross-check their voter registration or update the voter registration, that helps too. You can also do, I know in some places they do this, they will look at the Social Security death register every now and then, and they'll pull people that have died that are on that register. Usually there are rules about how they can do that. And there are rules about how they can do voter maintenance, list maintenance everywhere. I know that John and Kevin will have some good thoughts on this too, but I think the takeaway is it can be done. There's a lot of options to do it. And if you're going to mail ballots to people unsolicited, absolutely you have to be engaged in more aggressive voter roll maintenance.
And I'll say I will lose some friends on this, but I do want to start with saying the claim that Stacey Abrams is making, the base claim, is incorrect. Not to comment on her overall movement or anything else, but her basic claim is that the 50,000 people who were taken off voter rolls in Georgia who didn't appear to necessarily be at that address, didn't respond to anything, didn't think it was important enough to vote in the last governor's race, didn't think it was important enough to come out and vote in the Obama-Romney race, would have all come out and voted for her, and she would have won the Georgia governor's race if they weren't taken off the rolls. And I think the Republicans have had a very effective response to that. It's great. Just please bring in witnesses of anyone from that list who says they would have come to the polls and voted if they weren't taken off. And through a whole session, the Democrats have produced no one, not one person who came in and said, I was going to vote, but I was taken off the list. So there's been a much bigger purge since then. I don't know. There could be, bigger questions because a lot more voters have come off that list since then. But I would just be careful about jumping too quickly to say that kind of cleanup, was a voter suppression. I just don't think it was at that level when I really look at the numbers and what the criteria were. You know, I haven't dug deep into the arguments in Wisconsin and other places. You know, I do think at very least, this goes back to agreeing not to mail a ballot to everyone on the list, because at least that offers some security. If you're mailing an application to everyone, that's just one more chance for them to say, yes, I am really here. As a matter of fact, I want to vote, mail in, et cetera. So it seems to me like that's a partial step to be taken. But, you know, there's no question, you know, there are people doing things for partisan reasons. There are Republicans doing things for partisan reasons. I have been concerned that even some what I thought were good compromises, though, just get vilified one way or the other. I mean, I thought New Hampshire did an interesting thing. This was on voter ID, but could apply. They said, hey, you know, if you're not on our list, we're going to take a picture of you when you vote, mail it to the address you gave us, and unless someone comes back and says this person doesn't live here, you're fine. You'll never hear from us again. I actually thought that was a nice compromise. And I mean, the Democrats really went after that as vote suppression. I said, well, you know, I'm sure there's an argument that it is or something, but it just does seem like there's no middle ground here, no rational discussion going on right now. And I don't for a second doubt that there's certain people trying to get people off voter rolls they think will vote against them. So please don't take this as a, you know, all one-sided. But I think we need to be careful not to jump at the smaller cleanups that are done that can be valid.
Yeah, there's a whole host of ways that voter rolls can be kept clean. I mean, you know, regular contact between elections office and folks on their list to get positive confirmation that a person is who they are and live where they live, you know, that sort of thing. There was also some years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago, there was created a system where election administrators could cross-check databases across state lines, so that if somebody moved across state lines, you would know if somebody was registered over in that state, but also still registered in your state. So they couldn't do the vote early, vote often thing. I think, you know, one of the biggest things that if we want our elections to be run better is that a lot of localities are just going to have to get better funded. I mean, some of these elections offices are such tiny operations, and, you know, trying to keep clean database on 20,000 voters or 200,000 voters when you only have a handful of staff and we have a highly mobile society, it's an immense amount of work. And, you know, it's like anything else to some degree, you will pay, what you get is what you're willing to pay for.
You know, I think that all of this has been really excellent. And I would just really like to add to this, because Sarah has asked if there is something that can be done to automate this process of list maintenance. And I think that perhaps what you were alluding to, Kevin, was a program called ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration and Information Center, that 30 states in the District of Columbia participate in. And it is an extremely interesting and very well run program that allows states to enter their entire voter registration system, and then also another state system like DMV records or something similar, so that they have lots of information to match people against. Because the accusations of purging frequently happen after states do bad matches, because you would be shocked at the number of people whose names are Jessica Huisman and are born on my birthday. And generally that's the way that states are matching these roles. And so you wind up with a lot of people whose names are, for example, Jorge Ramirez, because that's a very common name, all born on the same day, and someone who is very much alive and living at their current address, getting a mailer that says, "Are you dead?" Which, like, we can all agree would be a little jarring. And so those sorts of things are interesting. And I also think that, you know, Republicans that I have spoken to are very concerned about list maintenance. But it strikes me that vote by mail would actually increase the ability for us to keep our voter rolls even more clean, because we have to know what address to send the ballot to. We have to know where you're registered so that it gets to you. So this has been sort of an irony of this current time that I have found particularly entertaining. Perhaps I'm just an elections nerd, but anyway.
To underscore that point,
Yeah.
what Kevin said about funding, you have to be funded to have an ERIC subscription. You have to be funded to mail those postcards to people. You have to have staff that oversee these things. So, one of the challenges is if we want to move that direction, if you want to maintain your voter rolls properly, our county clerks and our state governments need to be properly funded to have the technology and staff to do so. It's one thing to say, hey, do it. It's another thing to actually go do it.
Right. It's funny that you say that. When I first started covering elections, I was talking to a state elections official, and I think in Mississippi, and he said to me, the thing that you have to understand about elections is that we're funded on the same budget line as the gazebo in the park. And that has been something that I have really taken to heart as I've covered elections over the last 4 years. Like, very frequently it is, should we buy new voting machines or should we update the playground? And those decisions are real for counties. And I think that we need to sort of have a readjustment of our priorities. But Keith has asked a really thoughtful question, and it's a little bit long, but I'd like to read all of it. So just bear with me for a second. I find the United States' inability to transform its election system to reliably guarantee citizens the ability to have unimpeded access to voting not only unconscionable, but an impediment to the democracy it claims to be the leader. In Canada, for example, they take voting machines to voters' homes when they are unable to get to the polls. When do you see the polarity and politics being purged from the election system and a unified focus on guaranteeing everyone's right to vote in the most efficient and effective means possible? So I know that's a really loaded question, but I would love to get all of your thoughts on it. Sarah, do you want to start?
I think, the United States, we certainly have aspirations that we don't always live up to. But one of the things that brings us together from our local communities all the way up to the national level are these ideals that we all collectively hold. And we do believe in democracy. We do believe in free and fair elections in this country. My think tank is named after Joseph Rainey, who was born a slave and later became the first African-American member of Congress. So I think starting from the point that we do have these values and focusing on them is the place that I would go. The second part of that is we do need to put our money where our mouth is. Canada has a much smaller population than the US, so it might be easier for them to have mobile voting machines. The United States has a very different demographics, different geography. Accessible voting in urban areas versus rural areas looks different. Ballot chasing looks different. As John pointed out earlier, if you go to, you can go collect a lot of ballots in an apartment building or a nursing home in a city versus if you're going to try and collect ballots for folks in a rural area, it might be 5, 10, 15 miles between each ballot that you're picking up. It's just different. And these different realities need to be addressed, which is why it's important to, in addition to keeping our values and our aspirations at the forefront, to remember that every county and every state has different needs and different realities in terms of what accessible voting looks like. I do think and respecting that I think is important. I do think one key way that we can kind of get past some of the polarization, I do a lot of work with state policymakers, and I can tell you they love technology. They love new approaches. They love hearing about, they'd love if somebody invented, a secure app that an election official used and could go to someone's house that they could vote on. They would all love that, just on a curiosity basis. So as we kind of move in different directions, maybe even taking people to see, this is how we print ballots when we mail them out. This is the machine that scans them. Sometimes that can make a difference. And those are technology too. They're a little older than an app on a cell phone, but it's technology and it works. And exposing people to the actual realities of how things function can be a great way for them to think differently about how people can vote.
And I'd say it is a great question and goes back to my opening was we need to make it as easy as possible to vote and it's hard to cheat. Bring in as many new methods as you can. And then with each one, really war game how someone could game the system, cheat the system. I mean, let's face it, the elephant in the room here is electronic voting. That's a much tougher question, which would have been beyond the scope of this hour. I think there's systems like votes that were just used in Utah that the Republicans loved, and certainly given the electronic option would give a lot more people. Now, I've talked to some very left-leaning programmers who are scared to death of the concept of any kind of electronic programming, just with the hacking potential. But my point is, well, if an 11-year-old programmer has been shown to be able to break into the actual in-person voting and flip your vote, then, I mean, that's an issue too. There's always an issue. But I think to tackle things like that, how do we make it as easy as possible while validating who someone is to get that vote to them? And as I said, it may be impossible, places in America to actually bring a machine to someone. But I was impressed in South Carolina. I was there for the voting. We were just exit polling. And just how quickly now they bring voting machines out to cars, at least. I mean, that's one step, so if there is an issue with someone's mobility, you don't have to give a big excuse. You just have to say, hey, I'd like the machine brought out to me. And I watched them do that. It just seemed like every 20 minutes the precinct does that. Someone just made the request and they walked out. And also, I'd say, not to get on the side issue, I won't name the liberal organization. I was on at the forum last year, and they said they thought, the biggest impediment to turnout in the U.S. was voter ID, and they put up a list of the countries with the highest voting participation. And I had to point out that their top 7 all had strict voter ID laws, the top 7 countries. As a matter of fact, every country in front of us had it except parts of England, really the only other democracy, and Australia, where it's mandatory. And interestingly enough, even though Australia is the only one with mandatory voting, they just had their lowest turnout since 1922. No voter ID requirement. 10% said, I'd rather take a fine than vote. So at some point, you have to say that the person has to want to vote. But I agree complete with the question. The more mobile we can be and the more options we can give, just looking at the security at every new step we take and what we need in this arena to make it easier to vote without illegal votes coming in or hacking, we need to move in that direction.
Yeah, I like Keith's question. It's a good one, and it's a lot of layers to it. So I'll have to limit what I say because we are short on time. First, certainly it's not a proud moment when we see people waiting in line outside polls for hours. I mean, that sort of thing just shouldn't happen. We can do better. We should do better. And it gets back to, can we put our money where our mouth is and make sure this sort of stuff doesn't happen? The second thing is that, I was going through some data from Pew about voters' attitudes about access to voting. And overwhelmingly, Americans thought, yeah, it's pretty easy to vote. They don't feel like they're being run through, most people don't feel like being run through a huge amount of hassles in order to vote, at least in a normal year. These were pre-COVID data, to be clear. But the bigger issue is that we have pretty low participation rates because people just choose not to show up. And the Pew data showed that folks were not showing up because they thought, my vote won't make a difference. I don't really like politics. And that sort of cynicism's kind of self-defeating behavior is a tough nut to crack. And it's something we do need to figure out because it does seem symptomatic of a sort of disaffection from the system. And it's not a vote of confidence when you look at the public opinion about how favorable do you feel towards government institutions, other than the Postal Service, which seems to be pretty well loved. Most government institutions are not super high respected. So that's something we gotta work on. And I do think that over time, we're going to probably see a continued press for a more neutral administration or clearly neutral administration of US elections. I think a lot of folks are really tired of the whole gerrymandering fights that go on in states year after year and the push to say, like, we need an independent commission to divvy things up. Like, it's mutual assured destruction. People don't like it. And then when you look at the issue that John has worked on for so many years about the flows of dark money and all that other stuff into elections, people on both sides are pretty sick of what they're seeing. And I gotta wonder that over time, if a dam is gonna bust and we're gonna see some improvements on those counts and we'll get elections that are perhaps a little bit more close to our ideals.
I think that's really good. So we only have 2 minutes left, but there is one question. And so if you can offer a very brief thought, if you have one, that would be great. We have, how does the outlook for independent candidates candidates change with digital transformation in elections?
Two parts to that answer. One, I don't think we have enough data yet to know. And it depends what you mean about digital. Do you mean campaigning using social media ads? Do you mean digital voting? I think we just don't have enough data. My guess, my educated guess would be that it wouldn't make much of a difference, simply because people are still going to vote primarily based on their party affiliation. That's going to be their default. So an independent candidate is going to have to make a strong case and make an impression to budge people out of that default. But that is an area where maybe ranked choice voting would make more of a difference.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think instant runoff ranked choice voting is the whole key there. If your vote for an independent is a throwaway vote, there's no point in ever doing it. And at the same time, it protects a party candidate if a opposing candidate has just been hired. The Democrats have found a libertarian to run, or the Republicans have found a Green Party candidate. So it gets rid of the fake independent candidates, but it actually gives the real ones a chance. So I think instant runoff is really where the whole independent move starts.
My sense is that candidates from either of the two parties tend to have trouble running against the election systems that work for them. And as such, independent voices do bring something new to the table, and they can at least make the elections issues salient and draw attention to them. And one hopes over time that that would lead to improvements. Okay,
perfect. Well, guys, we are out of time. I learned a lot today. I hope you all did too. Thanks so much for being here with us. And I had a lot of fun moderating. And I wish you all luck as you continue this digital conference today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.